needs to be a lot of, well, you could say investigative journalism done on this. But of course, who's going to allow you to report, unless you have an independent platform, on the reality of what's going on? I've heard of some of the social media platforms banning attempts to expose this. A contact of mine tried to expose this on his Facebook page and it got suspended. But it's worth trying to expose. It's worth trying to get the word out. I think maybe YouTube might be one way of doing it, but you have to try and get to the hospitals and do some filming and investigations as to how crowded or not crowded those hospitals are, and look deeper below the surface on what the government is claiming.
Right. Well, I mean, you mentioned that mainly politicians and celebrities and elites are involved in this satanic ritual abuse.
But also a lot of ordinary people as well.
Why don't you hear about more people being exposed?
Before I go into that, before I forget, just a last point about the COVID-19. About 1 year before the COVID-19 lockdown in January 2019, I interviewed an SRA survivor who very unusually, because it's not common among SRA survivors to say that they experienced this, this was in England. He told me that when he was a child, not only did he suffer SRA from Satanists, but they were also conducting medical experiments on him. And the medical experiments were all about infectious diseases. Infectious diseases like, for example, COVID-19. Of course, COVID-19 did not exist back then. They were looking at how to manufacture an infectious disease, the Satanists, and they were looking at how to create a vaccine for the infectious disease, not out of the goodness of their heart, but to create leverage over those who suffered from the illness, and also to protect themselves, probably. And when the COVID-19 pandemic broke out, I asked him a few questions, including, do you think it was experiments on you to create an infectious disease like COVID-19? I think COVID-19 is probably a human-engineered virus. Secondly, to create a vaccine for it so that they could use it as leverage over others. And he said, yes, all of that. That's what he believes he was experimented on for. And he actually brought me to the medical research labs in England, where there's still research going on today. A lot of it is, on the surface at least, legitimate research. Some of them are owned by pharmaceutical companies.
And how would they use the vaccines as leverage?
Well, for example, if there was a human-engineered virus that was so difficult to contain and deal with, except by vaccine, and the Satanists had the vaccine, access to it, they could basically get people to do what they want in order to obtain the vaccine, couldn't they? Because it's a matter of life and death. And so he who controls the vaccine will control the world if it's a world pandemic. And if it's a real pandemic, not just jacked up numbers, but the real thing, that people are really dying in large numbers, people will do practically anything to get that vaccine. So for the Satanists, it could be, well, you do what we want, or you sign up to become a Satanist, and then we'll give you the vaccine.
Right.
Amazing form of controlling people, especially if they're worried that without the vaccine, they will die. So maybe this is what the real story is behind the COVID-19. But I would say it's probably, if it was engineered by the Satanists, it's probably a test run for something even bigger to come at some point in the future. So a test run. because what may come in the future may be even worse. May have people on their knees before the Satanists wanting the vaccine, the only lifesaver that they can obtain to protect them and their loved ones from a real killer infectious disease that would make COVID-19 look like a walk in the park. I know this is a very pessimistic view, but I also know that the way the Satanists operate, they tend to be very ambitious. They tend to think big in evil terms. So they usually have bigger plans of evil to implement than what we see now. But this is for the future. So I find it a very interesting and disturbing coincidence that they would have this interest in medical experiments on infectious diseases. And then now we have this huge problem with COVID-19.
Yeah, but wouldn't a country just as much want to do something like that, experiment with infectious diseases to use them as bioweapons against other countries? I mean, wouldn't like a country, a rival country want to do the same thing?
Yeah, that's true. But why would Satanists be involved in this program? Why would they put their human subjects through SRA? That is my big concern. You see, if it was, for example, our intelligence agencies in the UK running these experiments and there was no SRA, then I would conclude that it's probably an intelligence agency going rogue, so to speak, beyond the boundaries of their authority in order to find an effective bioweapon they could use as part of their military defense of the country. But what we have instead are Satanists involved and doing SRA to their experimental subject at the same time as also on other days doing medical experiments on the person. The government agencies, probably the intelligence agencies, had some involvement in this, or awareness at least of this. I asked the survivor where he thought the files on the results of his experiments would be kept, because he's been wondering where he could get the paperwork on the experimentation done on him, because that would also be proof of what he went through. Mm-hmm. And he concluded that it's probably with the intelligence agencies in the UK, and that he won't be able to access it because of that. So yes, there was probably some intelligence agency involvement, but the lead seemed to be taken by the Satanists rather than the intelligence agency. The Satanists do have their own people in the intelligence agencies. So there was probably an overlap, but where the Satanists are involved, it's usually them taking the lead. Whether overtly or covertly, they are taking the lead. You can be quite sure of that. And why would the Satanists be so interested in experimenting on someone regarding infectious diseases?
So do you think there's Satanists working within these government agencies that are potentially developing chemical weapons or
bioweapons,
warfare weapons? Because, I wouldn't expect some satanic cult to have the money to do this kind of thing, to conduct these sort of experiments and to invest in scientists that know what they're doing.
Yes, you're right. They would tap into government money. They would use their contacts with government. There are Satanists in government and in the civil service. Even our ex-prime minister, Edward Heath, had at least 6 independent witnesses accusing him of satanic abuse.
What was his name?
So, Edward Heath. He was the Conservative UK Prime Minister in the 1970s, just before Margaret Thatcher. And as with Savile, the investigation was done after he died, years after he died. But the police in Wiltshire, which is one of the counties in England, because Edward Heath lived there, they led an investigation into allegations of Edward Heath's child sex abuse and Edward Heath's Satanist ritual abuse. And they concluded in their report, which is on the internet, by the way, Operation Conifer, it was called Operation Conifer's Summary Closure Report, stated that 6 people said that Edward Heath did satanic abuse to them. For years, I have known from various sources that Edward Heath was involved in SRA. But at last, we had a police investigation that officially concluded that he had 6 witnesses. These 6 witnesses who corroborated each other that Edward Heath was involved in satanic abuse. That's a large number for any sex offense to have 6 witnesses. Mm-hmm. Because the very nature of sex offenses, as you know, usually it's difficult to find more than one witness who is the victim. But it shows you how prolific Heath was in his abuse, both his child sex abuse and his satanic abuse. And he's the former Prime Minister of the UK.